in an increasingly segregated world, any physical space that encourages interaction across age, gender, race, class lines is generally a healthy thing because it allows us to see, people as our neighbors, as our friends, as people who live in the same general area.
I'm Nathan Maharaj. This is Kobo in Conversation. My guest is Dan Rubinstein, author of Waterborne, a 1,200-mile paddleboarding pilgrimage. In it, he tells the story of his journey via stand-up paddleboard through waterways around Montreal, New York City, Toronto, and his home in Ottawa. But it's also the story of all of us and how we benefit from spending time near bodies of water. Dan, welcome to Kobo.
Thank you, Nathan. It's great to be talking to you.
Let me start with a big obvious question, Dan. What's a stand-up paddleboard?
A stand-up paddleboard is, in my humble opinion, the easiest and most intimate way to engage with water. A more conventional or technical definition is that it's basically a big surfboard that you stand on with a long canoe-like paddle to paddle. Paddle boards can be hard shells, so
Hmm.
rigid. They can be inflatable. They can be all sorts of different shapes and sizes, from 5 or so feet for surfing to 18, 19, 20 feet long for custom trips. They can be narrow and fast and shaky. They can be wide and stable. So a board you stand on and paddle, but there's all sorts of permutations and combinations.
So that we've got the right image in our mind as we have this conversation about your journey atop a stand-up paddleboard. Thank you for that description of the category of vehicle we're talking about. What kind was yours? Is yours narrow and fast? Was it stable and broad?
It was 14 feet long. So picture, I'm 5'6", 5'5" probably. And if I hold it up beside me, it's basically 3 times my height, almost three
Okay.
times my height. So it's quite large. I used an inflatable board for a couple different reasons. One, it's portable. I could deflate it, put it in a large backpack, and carry it onto a bus or into a car. So that gave me some options when I was moving around. They're also more durable than hardboard. So a hardboard, if you bounce off rocks or concrete, you could ding it, you could put a hole in it, it could become waterlogged. The inflatables are really durable and can just basically ricochet off things and keep going. When most people think about inflatable paddleboards, they picture a little board that you play on with your kids at the lake. You use it as a swimming platform. This was basically like that, but I like to tell people it's an ocean-going vessel. I mean, you can take a 14-foot inflatable board and cross large bodies of water. So it's not a toy.
Hmm.
It's a pretty substantial beast.
Why then, why this mode of locomotion? I'll ask you about the journey in general, but why this particular mode of locomotion and not something like a kayak or canoe or literally anything else you could have been on the water on?
And literally anything else might have been easier than a paddleboard. But like many Canadians, I've done some canoeing and some kayaking, not a ton. And then I discovered stand-up paddleboarding about 10, 11 years ago. And it was love at first paddle. I love the fact that on a paddleboard, you can literally step off and swim and then climb back on, which you can't do in a canoe or kayak as
Mm,
easily. I love the perspective you have when you're standing. Not
mm,
only can you see better around you, but you can see down into the water more readily than you can while seated. I love the portability of, putting it on my back. I could ride my bike with it. I could take public transit in Ottawa to get to the river, so I could get around with it. And I've lived in half a dozen cities across Canada, all on either, in the case of Toronto, a Great Lake, in the case of Halifax, the Atlantic Ocean, and other cities on rivers. And I had never owned a watercraft of any kind. So when I discovered paddleboarding and got into it again a decade ago, it just took over my life. And I couldn't have conceived of this journey and this book project without paddleboarding. It was really integral to everything that I was doing.
Why did you undertake this journey? Tell me about planning these the legs of this voyage you did on this strange vehicle.
Yeah, so one of the wonderful things about being a nonfiction writer is that you can let your curiosity and interest and your passions really fuel your craft, and you get to call it work. So when I got into SUP, I instantly was like, okay, where can I go? Who can I hang out with and write magazine stories about paddleboarding? And I started to travel around British Columbia, Belize, Newfoundland and paddled everywhere I went. I brought a board with me or got a board in places that I traveled to and just met up with and interviewed and got to know some really incredible teachers and coaches and mentors. And they informed my kind of philosophy of paddleboarding, which was not this macho athletic kind of pursuit, but a paddling activity doing which you're really vulnerable to natural systems. You're
Hmm.
vulnerable to wind and weather and tides. As long as you take proper safety precautions, you're wearing a PFD, you're leashed to the board. If the water's cold, you're wearing a wetsuit or dry suit. Falling in is not an issue. So there's something about embracing that vulnerability that I really liked. So that kind of took off in half of my head. And then my journalist the other half of my head, I started to read and learn and write more about an idea, blue space, which is essentially the aquatic equivalent of green space. And I started to read about research that shows just how good it is for us. And
Hmm.
some research say it's profoundly better for us than spending time in other natural environments. So I started to paddle and write about blue space, and that's where the seeds for the book and the journey began. Was I wanted to explore blue space in depth in a literary way on a paddleboard. My original idea was kind of a bits and pieces book, like my first book, Born to Walk, in which I would
Yeah.
travel to different parts of the world, spend time with people whose lives or work revolve around water, and write a book about what happens when we engage with it in this intimate way. I actually wrote a book proposal, shared it with a writer, sailor, doctor friend of mine, Kevin Patterson, and he said, "Great idea, but you should do a crazy trip to link it all together." And I instantly knew he was right. So I tore up that proposal and began to think about journeys that I could undertake that would be the narrative core of a book. I also love exploring nature in my own backyard.
Yeah.
I live in Ottawa. Montreal's just downstream. You hang a right to get to New York, and then if you loop back via Toronto, it's just 1,200 miles and you're back home. So it was a nice contiguous journey in my part of North America.
Just a little jaunt. So you had conceived of this book originally then as things that you knew to be good about bodies of water and living near them that have an impact on human life. And you were prepared to write the whole book just with your paddleboarding passion as kind of a bonus that gives you a little personal insight. As you inserted your own passion into this, was that a tricky balance to strike, or did it really unlock the book and let you just write it?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely provided a narrative through line. As a fan of creative nonfiction and kind of the adventure genre, I like reading books like this. And now that I've done one, I like writing books like this because you're always moving from A to B to C to D. So there's a journey that you and the readers are part of. So that's a nice structure to have. I think there's a risk though with projects like this, and my agent who when she pitched it to an editor in New York, he said to her something along the lines of, "Great idea, I love it, but I don't know if we can do books like this anymore because a lot of adventure books are essentially white guy going and quote conquering nature, right? White guy being the fastest or the first, and that's not the kind of book I wanted to write. I mean, I
Yeah.
think although it's a kind of a weird trip I did, and I trained and had the gear and the knowledge and the experience to be able to pull it off. It wasn't about being the fastest or the first or the best. It was about slowing down and spending time with people along the way. So there was a bit of that tension in there where I was cognizant of the fact that it's kind of something that everybody can do in a sense. I mean, I think about paddleboarding. It's kind of like walking, albeit on water and Jesus illusion notwithstanding, it's just kind of a slow, sustainable way to move. So it's in a sense, it's an adventure book, but we like to call it kind of an anti-colonial adventure book because it's not about, blazing through a landscape and passing through. It's about immersing yourself in it.
Yeah, it really is a book where if there's like a prize you seem to be chasing, if there's a maximalist aspect to it, it seems to be that you're going for the most people you could meet along the course of a waterway.
Yeah, I mean, and that's another, bonus of the route I chose is that this is a really densely populated part of North America. I mean, there's people, towns, and cities everywhere along my route. I'm moving slowly, so people see me coming, they see me there, they see me going. There's lots of
About
opportunities.
just about what speed, just so we've got a sense of like how fast are you going?
Yeah, I mean, it varies, but typically on flat water without wind or current, you're talking 5-ish kilometers an hour, basically.
Yeah.
Sometimes slower if you're fighting the wind or a current. If you have a tailwind, which in my experience is extremely rare, you could be going 7, 8, 9 kilometers an hour. This is where kind of different board shapes and sizes
Yeah.
play a factor too. But
Yeah, these are speeds akin to foot travel.
Essentially, yeah. And you stand out too. I mean, you're standing on this weird thing. I had 3 dry bags on the deck, so I've got a 14-foot board with a bunch of gear on top of it. And so people see this thing coming at them slowly. And the common question I received was, what the heck is that? Who are you and where are you going, right? And for a journalist, for a writer who wants to engage with people, there's a natural entry point to a conversation when strangers are asking you questions. I did set up dozens of interviews with people along my route, again, whose lives or work revolve around water, who are doing really cool projects to reconnect communities to the waterways where they are. So that was part of the structure as well. But it was these serendipitous encounters with strangers that really became, I think, the core of the trip and the main theme of the book. I wanted to explore the role of blue space and how it can encourage psychological health, physical health, and ecological health. And really, I began to see water or blue space as a conduit to community.
Hmm. As you mentioned, you wrote a book called Born to Walk. That's how we came to meet because I interviewed you about that many, many years ago. Um, I thought a lot about that book, Born to Walk, um, when COVID had us all locked away inside. And part of the reason I was thinking about it was the concept I learned from that book was about green space, about being surrounded by the green blur of just moving on foot through these natural spaces, and just knowing, as I think a lot of us had to remind ourselves in those days, like it's good for you. Just get out there, just drag your miserable body out there and do it because you'll be better off for it. I wondered, and we'll get back to water in a second, but I want to stay for a minute on dry land. I wondered, what was that time of being locked away, but for a daily walk, like for you as an author of a book all about how good it is to just go for a walk?
I did spend a lot of time walking in Ottawa during COVID, during the early days, during the lockdowns. I'm a runner as well, so I spent a lot of time running. I'm a cross-country skier, so in winter I spend a lot of time skiing, and I was paddling. I was already well into my kind of paddling era at that point, so I spent a lot of time on the water. I remember heading to the Rideau River, which is quite close to my house in Ottawa, and this was a time when public parks were officially closed in the city, and I had an inflatable board, and I was pumping it up in the parking lot, and there was another guy pumping up a paddleboard in the parking lot. And we got to chatting and wondering, is this legal? Like, are we going to get in trouble? And he was a nurse, an emergency room nurse who worked at a hospital in the city. And he said, work has been really challenging. I need to get outside and do this. And I
Yeah.
said, I think you're good. I don't think anybody's going to give you grief. And talk about social distancing. I mean, this is like April. This is icy water, and you're out in the middle of a river. So there's nobody around. So it was a really healthy release or relief valve. And, it just kind of reset everything when I was able to get out onto the water during those early scary days.
In your answer, I notice there's a little bit of a narrative where you flee dry land very quickly. You talked a little bit about walking, a little bit about running, and very quickly you ended up on the water. Was did walking, I guess, did running, did just being on land, did that start to feel confining? Was water kind of deliverance to some kind of a freedom or a pressure release valve?
Yeah, because like within a few seconds of pushing away from shore, even if you're in the middle of a city, you feel like you're in another world, and you are. You're in blue space. I mean, you're balancing on this dynamic fluid substance.
Mm.
You're attuned to the physicality of it. You interact with wildlife in a different way. If you're surfing, which I surf, we have standing waves on the river here in Ottawa, so you can surf on the river in the city at certain times of year. So it's a really kind of adrenalized thing, and you're so in the moment that it was an instant escape from everything, right? You can get into flow state. You can do that by walking, by other forms of moving on dry land or snow. But for me, just something clicked on water, and there's a lot of deep psychology behind it. But I think the upshot is that our bodies are mostly water. Our world is mostly water. Every single living thing needs it to survive. It connects us all. If we were in the same room, uh, pandemic germs notwithstanding and masks, I breathe out, there's water droplets, you
Yep.
breathe in, you take them in, it literally connects us. It's just such an elemental part of who we are. So being in, on, or around that is, in a sense, it's like coming home, right? It connects us to our roots, to our origins, and there's lots of nuanced details about what's happening inside our heads and bodies when we're in these environments. But there's a reason why when you go to a city or in the community where you are, if you have a bit of free time and there's a lake or river in the distance, you're probably going to be drawn to it. You're probably going to want to go check it out, walk along it, right? You're pulled to this space. It's a very powerful force.
Yeah, it's clear as you outline it in your book that humans we just there are reasons we settle near bodies of water and big waterways. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because you saw so many different human activities along these waterways and bodies of water. What 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 is it that makes us? You know, it's good for us. Why do we keep being drawn to water?
One of the neat things, there's a woman I talked to at the University of Virginia, Jenny Rowe. She's an environmental psychologist, and she talked to me about how being in blue space triggers our parasympathetic nervous system. And one of the coolest things in all of her research, I think, is the observation that when you're around a body of water, especially a large body of water, but not necessarily, you get this feeling of extent, of boundless possibilities.
Huh.
Picture yourself on the shore of Lake Ontario in Toronto, looking out at this endless expanse of blue, and anything is possible, anything can change. But at the same time, because of this deep elemental connection we have to water, you also have a feeling of comfort and belonging. And that duality of feeling possibility but grounded at the same time is such a restorative feeling. It really rebalances us. So if you can spend time doing that, it's just amazing and sometimes almost instant reset. And there's other more nuanced psychological things happening. But being around water in a physical sense, it makes us more active.
Hmm.
So you might walk a little further or run a little further or just move around more because you're around water. It could be cooling the air so it's not as hot. It just could be there could be different stimuli that encourage you to keep going. So any extra movement is good for us. And then there's also research that shows that being in blue space, being around water, encourages cross-generational play.
Huh.
So you picture the grandparent at the beach with their grandkid, and they're on their hands and knees in the sand building a sandcastle. That grandparent might be confined to the couch at home, but when they go to the beach, they get this jolt of energy because they're in blue space. So it clears things up in our brains, it makes our bodies move, and it encourages this kind of social interaction as well. And these are all things I think we crave and need as a species, and things to some extent, and for some people in some communities to a large extent, we've gotten away from. So it's these healthy behaviors and activities that being around water can stimulate and encourage.
Mm. Yeah, I'm reminded of driving into Toronto along the Gardiner Expressway, and as you approach the city and you're leaving the highway-ish parts of the journey behind, the first thing you see, I'm realizing as you describe these scenes, is first you see people, then you see the water, because the people have congregated at the lakeshore. not just the lakeshore, the road we call Lakeshore Boulevard, but like literally the shore of Lake Ontario just draws people doing stuff, biking, running, whatever.
Yeah. And we're returning to these spaces. So, all of our communities are where they are essentially because of water. We took boats and we built cities and towns. That's where the industry went. That's where the transportation infrastructure went. That's where the pollution went. We treated our rivers and lakes as sewers. Lake Ontario was horribly polluted for a long, long time. But we've realized, since the Clean Water Act was passed in the 70s, since environmental awareness has grown, we can't just continue dumping our garbage, dumping our toxins into the waterways. It's going to poison and kill us all eventually. So these bodies of water, including Lake Ontario and Toronto, have become significantly cleaner since the 70s, over the past 50, 60 years. And now we're returning to these spaces, to these post-industrial brownfields, because we want to hang out there. And you're seeing recreational amenities, you're seeing residential space, you're seeing entertainment districts. We're rediscovering these waterfronts. So we turned our backs on the waterfront for decades, and now we're coming back there. And it's good for us from a health sense. It's good for our communities from like an economic sense. It's
Mhm.
good for environmental reasons that we've woken up and we're not just dumping our crap down the drain and down a ravine. So we're drawn there. And one of the adages I really like from organizations such as Swim, Drink, Fish and the Ottawa Riverkeeper and any environmental stewardship organization is to use it is to love it. To love it is to want to protect it. So the more time people spend at a beach on Lake Ontario, the more you're going to realize, we need to do something about sewage overflows to prevent, every time there's a heavy rain to prevent the lake from becoming unswimmable and becoming dirty. So the more people get out there, it's this virtuous circle, the cleaner it's going to become,
Mhm.
hopefully, eventually.
When you were talking with people working on conservation, on cleanup, you were already an enthusiast of just the sport, the activity of paddleboarding. But these folks had a different level of engagement with the medium you're traveling through. What did you learn from talking to people who were committed to this kind of mission?
Yeah, I think, I mean, a lot of it, and again, I mentioned earlier that I began to see water and blue space as a conduit to community. A lot of the projects that I reported on and a lot of the most inspiring people I met and places I stopped were community projects. So they
Yeah.
were places where, in the case of Ganawage, a Mohawk community across the St. Lawrence from Montreal, or Schuylerville, New York, a small town on the Hudson River and Champlain Canal. They're places that were polluted or disconnected from their rivers, from their waterways, and people have realized, this connection, this water is really valuable to us. We need to reestablish this connection. So there've been parks created. In the case of Ganawage, an island that was created when the St. Lawrence Seaway was built, has been renaturalized to be a home for domestic flora and fauna and a place for the people to hang out. This town, Schuylerville, New York, that I mentioned, there was basically a polluted island that was a dumping ground, and it's become this really amazing community park. And not only is it a place for people to go and hang out by the water, it's a place for all people to go. So it's become kind of a community melting pot in a sense, and people from all walks of life come there. In an increasingly segregated world, any physical space that encourages interaction across age, gender, race, class lines is generally a healthy thing because it allows us to see, people as our neighbors, as our friends, as people who live in the same general area. It's not the impersonal interaction we might have online or when you're stuck in traffic in a car, right?
Mhm.
So these environments get us to the waterfront, they get us re-engaged with the waterfront, and they get us re-engaged with one another.
As you were talking about communities reconnecting to water, is that what rewatering is? I think that's a word that comes up in your book.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard the term daylighting used for
Mm.
like urban streams that have been buried. But yeah, rewatering is when you bring water back to the surface of a community. There could be a small polluted creek in a city or town that's been fenced off and kind of where garbage has been. And, now that the water is cleaner, now that we're not polluting, the fences are coming down, trails are being built, access is being established or reestablished. And one of the other cool things about blue space research comes from a guy named Matt White, who's another environmental psychologist from the UK. He works out of the University of Vienna now, and he basically argues that if you have money, you're probably going to be healthy and happy. You know,
Mm,
affluence leads to a degree of wellness. If you're struggling socioeconomically, access to recreation and healthy activities is limited, and that limits your ability to reach kind of certain levels of wellness. So, restoring access to healthy outdoor environments in a safe way has a much more significant impact for people who are struggling than people who are already doing well. So it's almost a subversive way to help address some of the social determinants of health. Of course, you know, as society and communities, we need to invest in healthcare, in education, in housing, in employment opportunities. You know, these are the foundations of wellness, I would say. But if you can clean up environments and encourage people to get to these spaces, it can have a profound impact on their health. And I saw that especially in some of the communities I stopped at in New York State, which is kind of upstate New York,
mhm.
Rust Belt, you know, post-industrial towns along the Erie Canal. And, you know, people in some of these places are struggling. But when they have these outdoor environments that draw them together, that draw them to one another, it has this multiplier effect on their health and the health of the community as a whole.
Yeah. A lot of this is about access. A lot of this is about who can get down to the water. I imagine there are parallels between lack of access to blue space, water space, and green space. Did you find that was largely the case, or are there different ways for people to connect with their natural environment? Is it easier to go one way or the other?
Yeah, I think lack of access is a tremendous issue for both. I mean,
Mm,
you know, if land is private, you can't go hang out there, and it could also restrict access to a river or lake or ocean. Generally, the body of water is public, but if there's nowhere to get there or nowhere to hang out beside the water, if there's nowhere to launch your canoe or kayak or paddleboard, you can't be on it. So, yeah, it's not only about cleaning up these bodies of water. It's about, you know, facilitating an opportunity for people to get to them, to be on them. So there's infrastructure required, but it's not that expensive. And this is something that authorities in New York State have realized. It's not that expensive to build a gazebo, stick a picnic table underneath it, and build a kayak launch on a river. You know, it costs, you know, 50, 60, $70,000 to do this. It draws people to the town. It could have spin-off business, you know, implications. It could be a cafe or a restaurant that benefits. People will spend some of their money in the community, and
mhm.
then there's all the downstream health effects as well, right? So, one of the terms that I came across was aquapuncture, which is basically springing off acupuncture, which is, you know, a small action that has a significant impact on the body as a whole. So an aquapuncture is a small blue space intervention that could have a significant impact on the community as a whole. So whether it's a public swimming dock in a city or a kayak launch or a park beside the river, that act of aquapuncture can have these spin-off benefits that really multiply. And I mean, I experienced that in Ottawa this past summer, where on Dow's Lake, which is part of the Rideau Canal system, seen as a kind of a polluted pond, it's
Mhm.
actually clean enough to swim in. So this past summer, the National Capital Commission, which manages federal land in the Ottawa-Gatineau area, put a swimming dock on Dow's Lake, and it's a free public space. It's swim at your own risk, so there's no cost for lifeguards. You know, it's education, not legislation. Water safety awareness is part of the signage. And it was a really hot summer, and when I was walking or running by, I would often stop and jump in for a swim. And there were people hanging out there all day. And, you know, that dock, in the grand scheme of things, did not cost a lot of money and brought such joy and happiness to those of us who used it. So it's these little acts that can have much bigger impacts.
Yeah. You mentioned infrastructure. That's if we can shift gears, I'm really interested in parts of your journey where you and your extremely vulnerable position on this paddleboard, you were using things like locks. You were talking to people operating them. Can you tell me about that experience of navigating these places that didn't expect you? Um, Tell me about traveling through a lock on a paddleboard.
So much fun, so much fun. So I went through two canals in New York State. One is the Champlain Canal, which is only about 60 miles, and it connects Lake Champlain to the Hudson River proper. And then the Erie Canal, which connects the Hudson River to Buffalo, which is about 350 miles. And there's about 10 locks in the Champlain and 33, 35, I think, on the Erie. Officially, you're not allowed to go through the locks on a paddleboard. You're allowed to go through in a canoe or kayak, but the rules haven't evolved to the point where paddleboards are deemed safe. And I understand, if you don't know what you're doing, you could fall in. There's not a huge risk, but they don't want people swimming in locks. Thankfully, I had a couple of awesome contacts with the New York State Canal Corps, and they said, these are the rules. But if you wear your PFD, if you're kneeling on your board, so you kind of look like a kayak, and if you phone ahead and you're not an idiot, most times lock
Yeah.
tenders will let you through, and they always did. So
Yeah.
you call up. I had a list of all the phone numbers for all the locks. I said I was paddling through from the north or from the west, and could they lock me through? And they always did, and it's just magical kind of experience where these massive gates just kind of swing open, and you paddle in. There's a rope that goes down the side of the lock, and some of them, you're down 20, 30 feet, or to 40 feet, or you drop that much. And they're not the cleanest places. The
Mhm.
water's a bit slimy. There's goose poop all around. But I took, when I wasn't chatting with the lock tenders, or if there were people in boats beside me chatting with them, I used that downtime or uptime, I suppose, to take care of business. So I would have my arm around the rope, and I would have a snack, drink some water, make some phone calls, check my notes, check my map, check my weather apps, check the wind app. So it was 15 or 20 minutes where I could kind of take care of some of the logistics of traveling because I wasn't paddling. And because I'm only moving at 5 or 6 kilometers an hour, I don't want to take that many breaks because I was doing, 40, 50, sometimes 60 kilometers in a day. So I had mileage to make. So these locks were just these wonderful, kind of breaks in a way, but also social interaction. And you can also camp there. So often on these canals, that's where I spent my nights, was camping at lock stations. They have bathrooms and drinking water, which is basically all you need when you're traveling in this manner.
When you'd pick up the phone and call ahead, how many times did you have to like repeat yourself when you like described how you'd be approaching?
Not that often. I said paddling, not paddleboarding. So they might have expected.
Oh, I see. You cushioned the blow. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. There was
Okay.
there was one lock, one of the first locks I went through on the Erie Canal. It was, and if the locks, if I arrived after operating hours, they were like 9 to 6 or something. Typically, I would have to portage around them, and they didn't always have kind of an infrastructure for paddlers, so there
Hmm.
were no necessarily low docks to get off on. So sometimes I was climbing up these 8 foot ladders, one by one with my dry bags, and then hauling up the board, this 14-foot board, using the leash to get it up onto the shore, and then schlepping all my stuff, sometimes like half a kilometer to the other side and getting in. So it was much easier to do it when the locks were open. In one case on the Erie, I was approaching a lock where I was planning to camp. It was already getting dark, and I realized this lock was open until 9 or 10 p.m. that night for some reason. So I called the lock tender, and he initially was confused about what I wanted. And I repeated, I'm paddling from the west. Would you be able to lock me through? And he paused and he said, "Oh, you're the guy in the paddleboard. I heard about you. Come on in. I can't wait to meet you." So often, kind of word of my travels passed from lockmaster to lockmaster, a bit of a telegraph system, and they kind of took care of me. That they would call ahead to the next man or woman down the line and say it was coming through, and they gave me cold water. They gave me information about the water ahead. They told me about places I might want to stop or check out. So I felt kind of washed over and protected by them, which is really quite wonderful.
Well, I imagine their job is kind of dull and it's supposed to be dull because if it gets exciting, that means something's gone wrong. And so you were kind of the perfect entertainment for them. You were a responsible operator, the like of which they'd never seen before. So it was perfect. It
Uh,
was
Something different, something different. It's slightly different story in Canada on the Rideau because Parks Canada is a little bit more of a stickler for the rules, so I could not lock through. They kind of devised a bit of a workaround for me. but it wasn't really feasible. So I would have to portage. And a lot of the locks on the Rideau in Canada are manually operated. So th these men and women are turning big wheels to open these big gates. So it's a more physically demanding job. But
Mm.
part of the role is kind of being tourist, tourist officials and agents and operators. And they're just the friendliest, kindest. You're outside all day, hanging out by the water, so they're
Yeah,
happy.
true.
They're talking to boaters and paddlers and campers and picnickers and cyclists, and they're kind of like, they're spreading the joy of where they are. So I had wonderful experiences with lock staff everywhere on both sides of the border,
Yeah.
even if they didn't lock me through.
What was the hardest thing about making this journey, about these distances, about making it from point to point?
There were some really hot, humid days. So, it was a hot summer, July 2023. Days would be in the mid 30s, humidex closing in on 40. Um, in most cases, I could swim. So I would
Mm.
just jump in the water every 15, 20 minutes in whatever I was wearing and then keep cool by osmosis. And, that allowed me to put in 12, 14-hour days in the sun, in the middle of a body of water with no shade. But in some cases, after heavy rains, or there was some really heavy rain in the Hudson River, and a sewage pipe broke, and 20 different people texted me and said, "Don't go swimming today. There's raw sewage going in the river where you are," and I couldn't swim, and that gave me a taste of what it's like if our water, when and if, and in the past, our waterways were too polluted to be in, and how dangerous that is because they're such an amazing source of cooling. And if you can't take advantage of that, you're broiling, right?
Yeah.
So I think the heat I think was the biggest challenge. Yeah, I don't, I'm stubborn and foolish, and I can do the same thing for 12, 14 hours. You just kind of you get into this flow state. So I sometimes I would have, a crossing of a large lake on the St. Lawrence, or a section on the Hudson River where I knew, I've got this many miles. It's going to take 3 hours. It's late. I'm tired. I'm hungry. I have no alternative. I just need to paddle, for 3 hours and then I'll be there. And sometimes I would begin thinking about the mechanics of the paddle stroke. You reach, you plant the blade, you pull yourself
Mhm.
past the paddle, you feather the paddle back, and then you go back up and repeat. And I would almost repeat that like a mantra a few times. And then it would just lift away and an hour would pass and I wouldn't be thinking about anything at all. So it's this kind of metronomic meditative activity that allowed me to travel significant time and distance without thinking, here I am paddling again all day, right?
Mm.
So these are stretches when I wasn't with other people. But I would run into strangers, a brief hello, a brief chat gave me energy. I talked to animals, I said hi to birds and beavers and deer. And, when you're by yourself, you need to talk to somebody or something, right? So I found ways to kind of entertain myself while moving.
I want to ask you about a character that appears in this book, a character by the name of Swamp Thing. Can you tell me about Swamp Thing?
Yeah. So Swamp Thing is kind of what became my alter ego on this trip. I think, as I say, there's a little bit of Swamp Thing in each of us. It's our primordial roots. It's when we crawled into the muck, this is who we were. But it dawned on me one day. I was on the Erie Canal. I was hot. I was hungry. I was thirsty. I had food and water with me, but the water was not cold, and I'm tired of my energy bars and protein shakes, and I just wanted something else. And I saw one of those tall highway fast food signs off the water, off the Erie Canal, and in this stretch, the Erie Canal is just kind of like a river, basically. And I said, okay, I'm going to go stop and get some food. And there was nowhere to get off the water in this town. So I just basically pulled over to the edge of the river. It was a muddy, overgrown embankment. I tied my paddleboard to a tree and scrambled up through the bushes up this steep slope, and then ended up basically, stumbling into the back of this Dunkin' Donuts drive-through. And I just imagine people in their cars or in the restaurant when I walked in. I smelled bad. I probably had leaves and branches in my hair. And I came in and bought a whole bunch of food and a couple of drinks. And then I took them back down to the water because I didn't want my board to float away. and kind of gorged on my findings, knee deep in the mud, basically. So that's where Swamp Thing was born. And then they were with me for the rest of the trip because, I smelled bad, I looked bad. I was snacking amidst the goose poop in the lock stations, but I felt at one with all of the, in all of these environments. It kind of became part of my biome, I think, and it allowed me to, kind of feel comfortable at this interface where, you have this natural or somewhat natural body of water and you have a city or a town. And I was often on the margins in the transition zones, and Swamp Thing was very happy there.
What did your family make of this adventure of yours?
Different reactions from different people, not always fully comprehending what or why. When I ran the idea by my wife first, my wife is a writer named Lisa Gregoire. She immediately and instantly said, "Go for it." I think that's because she was tired of me complaining, about my typical middle-age ennui BS, and she said, "Just go, get it out of your system. Don't,
Go
don't,
for it.
yeah."
Emphasis on go.
Yeah, go. Don't get killed. Don't get hurt. But go have fun. And she said so, knowing full well that even after the 4 months of paddling, there would be a year and a half ish of book writing, which is an even more demanding time for the partner of a writer. So she gave me her blessing. My daughters, who were like 18, 19 at the time, they wished me luck, but I think the biggest impact on them was dad wasn't out buying, fresh fruit for the house anymore every couple of days. So, they realized I was gone because, it wasn't a constant stream of strawberries coming into the fridge. So they missed me, but in a different way. And then my parents were, I think they were worried. But my mom, is kind of a character in the book. And she's retired, but she worked in remote sensing. She's a geophysicist. And she kind of was following me. So she got on Instagram to track my progress. She would look up the cities and towns where I was passing through. She would look up the restaurants where I went or suggest restaurants for me in the places I was. We texted back and forth a lot. So she was kind of there with me throughout the trip, which was nice to have her presence and connection. During this journey. I think she was relieved when I finished. And then the broader family, I have relatives in New York State. The other layer to this trip is that my stops mirrored my family's stops in North America. So my mother's
Hmm.
family immigrated from Eastern Europe. They took a boat to Montreal. They were met in port by a relative who had preceded them, who brought them down to New York City, which is where my parents met. My dad came to New York as a grad student from South America. They get married in New York. They're ready to start a family. Vietnam era United States. They figured Canada's safer and quieter, so they moved to Toronto, which is where I was born and raised. So I was kind of mirroring my family stops in North America, and the children of the folks who took my mom and her family down to New York still live in New York City. They have a place on the Hudson as well. So I met up with them a couple times, and they took care of me on this trip. And there's a nice kind of a parallel that this family provided my family safe harbor decades ago, and now they provided me safe harbor along the way. So it's nice to be able to touch on that in the journey and in the book too.
Are there lessons from your previous book, Born to Walk, that you felt were there to serve you in writing Waterborne?
Yeah, I mean, I think that having a contiguous narrative from a literary perspective, it's more engaging, it's more compelling. It gives readers, the breadcrumbs to follow. So as
Mm.
much as I'm a fan of again what I call the bits and pieces book, I like having a more singular kind of thread to pull. Um, Beyond that, like I think, I mean, there's an obvious connection between Born to Walk and Waterborne, even though Born has an E at the end of it and Waterborne. I see this kind of as a sequel of
Mm.
sorts, where Born to Walk was about, the amazing health properties of walking and how it can connect us to the landscapes where we are, to the people who are around us, to the here and now. I think water can do that in an even more powerful way. So I think there's a leap. I think the challenges and crises we face in the world today, even though only been 10 years, which is maybe a long time between books, but a short time in the grand scheme of things. I think the challenges are bigger and more urgent. I certainly feel a greater sense of urgency, not only because I'm 10 years older, but because of what I perceive to be an accelerated rate of change and just crazy geopolitical uncertainty and, more environmental calamity, even though we're not paying attention to environmental crises anymore because there's other crises that have bumped them off the front page, so to speak. So there's an urgency, and I think, for us to kind of push the pendulum back or turn the corner or try to encourage and propagate more positive change and to make things better in whatever way we can. I see water having the power to do so. I mean, because not only because of the health benefits in both personal, community, and ecological, but because it allows us to see one another as human beings. And, this is not a political book, but when I travel the Erie Canal, it's a largely right-leaning Republican part of the United States. There were a lot of Donald Trump signs and flags everywhere I went, and including the properties of people I hung out with and talked to. We didn't talk politics. We didn't get into arguments. We talked about the weather. We talked about the water. We talked about where they lived and their homes and my journey. And we established, a basic connection as people. And I think that's a really important thing that we've gotten away from to a large degree. There's another book I read this past summer called It's Only Drowning by an
Hmm.
American writer named David Litt. And it's kind of a surfing memoir, but he's a former Obama speechwriter, and he essentially learns how to surf from his Republican Joe Rogan fan, electrician, blue collar brother-in-law. And there's a challenging tension and dynamic between these two men. But in the end, as David writes, it's not about finding common ground, it's about finding neutral territory. And they were able to coexist and understand one another's perspectives because they spent time with one another around the water. And my book and my journey wasn't me and one other person. It was dozens, hundreds of other people in many, many different places. But I understand what he was saying. It's about finding neutral ground and establishing the basis of a connection, establishing the basis of relationship, a conversation. And that's where things can grow from and develop from.
I think that's a great place to close. Dan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Nathan. It's been a great chat. I feel like I could go on and on forever.
I have been speaking with Dan Rubinstein, author of Waterborne, a 1,200-mile paddleboarding pilgrimage. Find it and the other books we spoke about, including Dan's other book, at Kobo and Conversations home on the web, kobo.com/conversation. There's a link in the show notes for you. Follow us in your podcast player of choice to catch every episode. If you enjoyed this one, splash a few stars on us. We won't mind. Kobo in Conversation is produced and hosted this time around by me, Nathan Maharaj. Thank you for listening.